All right, welcome back. I hope you guys had a good break. Welcome back to the Berkeley Global Jazz Institute Symposium for Interconnected Arts and Music and Performance. I'm Nadia Washington, your host today. Thank you. And I am honored to introduce the next speaker, especially for my fellow music and social activism classmates. You know, now's the time we get our burning questions a go and get them answered. All right, our next topic of discussion is they don't sing as they used to. The multiplicity of music and dance on the Southern Plantation. Okay, I'd love to introduce Dr. Katrina Thompson. Please give her a round of applause. But before you come up, yes, please. Yes. Dr. Katrina Thompson is a historian and author. She received her PhD from Stony Brook University. Her critically acclaimed book, Ring, Shout, Wheel About, The Racial Politics of Music and Dance in North American Slavery, examines the conceptualization and staging of race through the performance, sometimes coerced, of black dance from the slave ship to the minstrel stage. She has been the recipient of many awards, including the Jesuits' recognition as Most Impactful Person at St. Louis University and the Erskine A. Peters Fellowship of the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She currently serves as a professor of history at St. Louis University, where she often takes an interdisciplinary approach to research and teaching by incorporating methods and theories from cultural studies, American studies, women and gender studies, and mass media, and finally, performance studies, diaspora research, and literature. Please welcome Dr. Katrina Thompson.
Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. She has a great voice. I didn't want to go. I was like, oh gosh, I'm not going to sound as good. But thank you. So, the history of slavery in the United States is filled with stories that depict a Southern setting with blacks tirelessly toiling in the fields under the authority of white masters. The music of the slaves, all the while providing the scene score. Music, song, and dance were intertwined into every aspect of slaves' life. This lecture will address these scenes of blacks performing for a white audience as complicated entertainment that was both resoundingly positive and negative aspects of life for blacks and whites throughout the Southern plantation. So I am very thankful for being here, and thank you so much for inviting me. This is very exciting to sort of see how some of you have interpreted my work. I know you said some questions answered. It's always like nerves, like what's the question? But thank you so much for inviting me. And when I was thinking about what specific topics within the book I wanted to speak on, I thought it would be appropriate to begin this talk with the story of how I first was interested in studying music and dance and slavery, which essentially started in graduate school at Stony Brook. For a class assignment, I interviewed my great aunt, Ruth Gallman, who was at the time 105 years old. In her right mind, that's what we say down south, so she had a really great memory. During our interview, she continued to refer to the stories of her mother and grandmother, both women who lived to be past 100. So I'll be here for a while. You know, I always tell my husband, I was like, you're the first, because I'm going to outlive him. So they were born slaves in Louisiana. And so within these conversations, she made a statement that essentially began my journey. She stated, they brought her down here and sold her, you see. They have them on a big block and make them stand and act a certain way. If they think you good, they buy you. You didn't act right, they wouldn't buy you. From that simple, somewhat simple statement of an experience within a domestic slave trade, my curiosity was piqued. And I began to ask questions such as, what does it mean to act right on an auction block? I understood to act was to take action, do something that was often very intentional. So within this thought process, I transformed the word act to perform and started to wonder what it mean to perform on the auction block or within the overall slavery system. Why was this performance or a particular way of acting a story told by Ruth Gallman, grandmother, and why was it remembered 150 years after the ending of slavery? These questions essentially progressed into a recognition that music and dance was an active part of the act or performance of the auction block and the overall slavery system. But music and dance in slavery isn't a new revelation. It has been long recognized that the performing arts were an aspect of the institution of slavery, with many scholars focusing on it as a relic, or rather cultural continuance, that West Africans transported with them in the Middle Passage to North America and the West Indies. Beyond it being a cultural continuance, music was also a popular area of study for scholars with numerous publications on the music of slavery, from labor songs that the enslaved community used to keep pace during long hours of work, to spirituals, which were religious music of blacks that became quite popular in North America and Western Europe post-slavery due to performances like the Fifth Jubilee Singers. In fact, after slavery ended in 1865, music and dance was one of the most popular aspects of the memory of slavery. For example, in an Alabama newspaper, the Independent Monitor in 1869 charged, it stated, "Negroes as bondsmen were happier. We never hear the ringing horse laughs, the picking of banjos, beating of tambourines that formerly marked their sans souci experience." Over 50 years later, a white Georgian woman stated in an interview, "They don't sing as they used to," referring to Southern blacks. "You should have known the old darkies of the plantation. Every year, it seems to me they have been losing more and more of their carefree good humor. I don't know them anymore, and I'm free to say that I'm scared of them." In the early 20th century, journalist Ray Stannard Baker traveled throughout the South with the desire to make a clear statement, quote, of Negro in American life. Baker toured throughout the South, interviewing people of all races and observing race relations. Revealing public sentiment, Baker exposed what by the turn of the 20th century had become a common American nostalgia for an imagined Old South in which blacks were happily docile slaves and whites held a paternal power of love for the black community. The fear of the rising new Negro at the turn of the century only encouraged a persistent stereotype that affiliated blacks' innate docility with propensity for the performing arts of music, song, and dance. Baker stated that, quote, "Temperament of the Negro is cheerful. He overflows from his small home and sings and laughs in his streets. No matter how ragged or forlorn he may be, good humor sits upon his countenance, and all his squalor is not unpicturesque. A banjo, an exciting revival, gives him real joys." Many white Americans at the turn of the century shared Baker's biases, which derived from nostalgia of the Old South, or rather lost cause ideology that never truly existed outside of folklore and imagined memories. Baker assessed that blacks who were singing, dancing, and performing for or in the presence of whites were happy and submissive, content in their offering of entertainment and amusement. That role of blacks as performers and whites as audience were then lost due to the ending of slavery, but strongly remembered as a major aspect of the overall institution. In an effort to understand the multiple roles that the performing arts held in slavery, I reframed the common language of slavery and incorporated performance, or rather theatrical rhetoric, evident in my chapter titles. In Ring, Shout, Wheel About, I recognized that race was a theatrical performance in which whites and blacks contributed to a cultural script. The terminology I applied to American slavery of stage, spectacle, scene were utilized to relay the reality that the crimes of slavery are not witnessed, but staged. And so you can sort of see through my chapters, the first being the script, casting, on stage, backstage, advertisement, which is essentially the internal slave trade, and same script, different actors, and that specifically looks at the rise of the minstrel show, blackface minstrel show. And so today I'm focusing on the plantation performances, or what I refer to on stage, backstage. These are very familiar theater terms, with on stage essentially being on or onto a stage, on a part of the stage visible to the audience. Backstage being of relating to occurring or situated behind a performance area of a theater, concealed from the public, private. So it's sort of like your public self and then your private self. And I use these terms because recognizing that slavery is not simply what whites saw and viewed as slaves, and there's this sort of private community that was intentionally secret, and that's the backstage, and sort of understand the complex culture that developed. So let's go on stage within the plantation community and with a scene that has recently become quite popular a few years ago with the movie 12 Years a Slave in Solomon Northrop. "Dance, you damn niggers, dance," Master Epps shouted to the miserable lot of slaves. With a slash, crack, and flourish of the whip, he ordered his human property to dance. No matter how worn out or tired they were after a long day in the cotton fields, he would tolerate no halting or delay or slow and languid movements. All must be brisk and lively and alert. Slaves worked on the plantation fields from dusk to dawn under the hot sun and with inadequate food and rest. Regardless, during the evening hours, the slave community was expected to perform through music, song, and dance for their white masters. Epps demanded slaves to move up and down, heel and toe, at the unhappy festivities. The tired performers jumped lively, shuffled their feet to the sounds of the violin, while Epps and his wife watched with whip in hand, ready to fall on the wretched souls who dared to rest for even a moment. It was a scene that could have been seen throughout the South, as slaveholders played the role of choreographer, directing the chorus bondsmen and bondswomen to perform a cultural and social script on the plantation stage that held great importance to the Southern community. From humble origins, Epps continually strived to enter the planter class. As a driver and overseer on a cotton plantation in Louisiana, he gained a reputation among both blacks and whites, slave and free, as being, quote, a nigger breaker. Well known for his faculty for subduing the spirit of the slave, Epps freely used the whip to work, to rape, and to dance his slaves. Similar to other Southern, quote, gentlemen seeking status in the planter world, Epps used music and dance to publicly assert and legitimize his power. After years of work, Epps was able to lease a cotton plantation in Bayou Huff, Louisiana, and acquire a small lot of 9 slaves. To further advance his status, Epps invested in the illegally enslaved violinist Solomon Northrop. In the early 1840s, investing in the performing arts was a custom throughout the South that allowed many whites to publicly display their wealth. For Epps, who often joined his dancing slaves, and his wife, Mary Elvira Epps, who was profoundly fond of music, these performances confirmed their status in the community while providing amusement in their daily lives. You really sort of held some status, and you can afford to have a slave simply to be a musician. That elevated you in the planter class. The violinist was frequently called to the house to play before the family and was often used as entertainment for invited guests. The spectators on Epps' plantation could not restrain their laughter upon witnessing the boorish pranks of the entertaining slave community. The music of the violin, the shuffling of the feet, and the laughter of the slaves were all a part of the atrocities of the plantation society for the enslaved community. However, for Master Epps and many whites throughout the South, this was the expression of authority, potential wealth, and amusement. Slaves are generally expected to sing as well as to work, assessed ex-slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Douglass' assessment echoed long held in Western Europe and American racial expectations. Slaves performed music, song, and dance for white audiences. The Southern plantation became a stage, and white slaveholders, overseers, and drivers were the choreographers to the public display of enslaved black performing for the appeasement of white desires for dominance. These on-stage performances were for the benefit of the white audiences and the masters and owners. Within these orchestrated amusements, blacks were not only performers, whites also performed their desire upon the enslaved community. Master Epps' violence against his slaves and forcing them to sing, play music, dance, and laugh cast him in the role of overseer, planter, and patriarch, displaying for all his power, his domination, and most of all, his whiteness. Beyond doing so, he intentionally masked the emotions and hardships of the slave community with pretense of docility and happiness. The pageantry of the coffle, the spectacle of the auction block, and the minstrelsy of the plantation all provided evidence of the terror and enjoyment in the institution of slavery. The first steps towards using blacks as amusement in the South was the building of stages. Ex-slaves James W. Smith, born of the Hallman family plantation in Palestine, Texas, remembered that his master made special arrangements for enslaved community to publicly dance and sing. In order to facilitate the dancing and singing, Smith's owner had them build a stage, which actually was not uncommon throughout the South. And on Saturday night on his plantation, they would have jigging contests between slaves of other plantations. Former slave Wesley Jones also remembers his slave master in South Carolina building a platform for these performances. He recalled saying, "Any darky that can cut the buck and do the pigeon wing was called up to perform the platform." The construction of stages on plantations throughout the South epitomizes the entertainment aspect of these performances. These physical stages were a part of the setting of the metaphorical on-stage performances. The stage, which was built by slaves, personified the performance aspects of the scenes. On the plantation, slave masters often pitted their slaves against slaves from neighboring plantations in the performing arts and bet on the quality of the performances. The competitiveness of these events only heightened the pastimes for many whites who also loved to gamble on cards and horse risk was part of their culture and signified their wealth and power, and for many, their masculinity. Slaveholders often organized and judged dancing contests, provided prizes for those slaves they considered to be, quote, the best dancers or the best singers. As one Virginia planter advocated in a Southern Agriculture newsletter, awards should be also a part of the system. Whenever there is displayed particular good conduct, this goes a great way in their management. Beyond placating their slave community, these events gave white owners the ultimate form of control, intruding on the separate lives and culture of black slaves, attempted to create for themselves away from the plantation regime. The white slaveholders who imposed themselves within black dances influenced the style of the performance. If an overseer performed a fast jig to the ring dance, if he preferred a fast jig to the ring dance, then he imposed his partiality, which caused many blacks to alter dance and music technique while also likely affecting the performance privately. So these type of performances and whites enforcing, it's going to help to construct a new type of African American culture, a part of sort of what's publicly accepted and expected. Whites were proud of such slaves and recognized their talent or ability to outdance or outfiddle other plantation slaves as a sign of their own elevated status and benevolence as masters. Beyond building stages and hosting contests, many slaveholders also furnished musicians for this Southern custom. In the mid-19th century, the Beaux Review was one of the most popular monthly Southern agriculture newsletters that offered advice on managing the slave community. Several planters boasted in this publication that they purchased musicians specifically for these plantation performances. Slave musicians fetch a higher price on the auction block, and people often talk about slaves that maybe have very fertile, or they can sort of do a lot of work, physically able. Actually, musicians were some of the highest costs on the auction block because that's how much it was recognition of their status. One Mississippi planter bragged that he bought a good fiddler and kept him well supplied with catgut, and it was a fiddler's duty to play for the Negroes every Saturday night until 12 o'clock. Another planter featured in this publication also proudly bragged that he would buy the fiddle and encourage it among his slave population. Purchasing slaves for their musical abilities was a public sign of a planter's wealth. Musicians often fetched a higher price on the auction block, and some blacks, such as Solomon Northup, was kidnapped into slavery mainly due to their musical abilities. The daughters of a wealthy South Carolina slaveholder, Elizabeth Pringle, remembered her father sending young lads to learn to play the violin every year. So not only did they purchase musicians that were often slaves, they often sent their slaves to school to learn particular instruments for various festivities on the plantation. These musicians provided music for black performances that served as pastimes for the white community, but they also were used in private black assemblies. Facilitating these onstage performances while advocating the innate relationship between blacks and performing arts was part and parcel of white slaveholders' attempt to define blackness and slavery, and in doing, ultimately define themselves. Characterizing the black race as carefree, infantile, hedonistic, and indifferent to their suffering was an important part of establishing and supporting slavery. White's construction of blackness also facilitated the perception of African American race. On-stage performances contribute to the overarching stereotypes of black in the southern United States. On-stage performances often represent a false reality or facade of race and social relations within the institution of slavery. The promotion of these, quote, innocent amusements served as a central strategy in slave owners' effort to cultivate content, subjugation, while defending bondage. The orchestrated amusements helped to deflect the vigorous torture and abuse of blacks throughout the South. On-stage performances always included the use of the whip, either literally or figuratively, to make blacks sing and dance. During the holidays on Mr. Covey's Plantation, ex-slave Frederick Douglass spoke of the manner in which the fiddling dancing would be presented within the performance and singing of merry songs took place. Every once in a while, a sharp hip is given by slaveholders to the performing slaves. Because you have to realize it's not only that they're singing, dancing, they have to smile, they have to laugh, it has to look happy. And so the whole thing it's very well staged, and they're bringing in guests to see this. In some areas, they're bringing in newspapers, and newspapers are reporting how happy these slaves are, which means this slave master is great. He is truly a Southern gentleman. Music dance thus became tied to the violence of slavery, turning a form of amusement into one of terror. It wasn't unusual for if sometimes slave masters would join into the dance, and they would pick particular women who were dancing or dance with them. We see this in the middle passage, and those would be the women that they were raping or will rape that evening. So dance was also a prelude to rape. It wasn't usual to just get the women out, dance, and then decide who to rape. So it was really a part of the torture of slavery in many ways. However, according to many Southern whites, the performing arts held the power to alleviate black pain. As one Georgian proudly boasted in the Southern newsletter, American Cotton, Planter, and Soil of the South, he encouraged music because it has positive, humanizing, elevating powers. This was a common belief that influenced public perceptions of slave life. The performing arts distracted from the atrocities of the institution while comforting many Southern whites into a false sense of black complacency. Either whites portrayed music and dance as a mechanism to make slaves happy, or they averred that blacks were innately happy and that music and dance were simply public signs of their mirth. As a daughter of a Virginia planter, Letitia Burrell believed that all slaves on her father's plantation were merry-hearted, and among them I never saw a discontented face. Simplifying blacks into laborers and entertainers allowed for dismissal of emotions and mental capabilities. Many Southerners initiated and distributed the opinion that blacks are naturally prone to gaiety. However, it remains doubtful that many of them completely believe this facade. The use of the whip to force happiness purposely went unmentioned by most planners and overseers in their notes. In 1851, one Georgia planter, Nathan Bass, won an award in which he specifically detailed that slaves were generally happy, and if they were chanting their favorite ditty or allowed to dance, which most of them have quite a taste for, according to him, for the slaves would then remain happy and docile creatures. On-stage music and dance fostered these ideas and allowed for this false veneer to cover the Southern landscape. Southern slaveholders purposely created the images of black inferiority, sexual aggressiveness, and contentment in bondage by many slaveholders to garner acceptance and curb criticism from the North in Europe. In order for the fragile master-slave dominant subjugate dichotomy to survive, Southern planners needed the public performances of music and dance not only for personal assurance, but to gain general acceptance for the external communities. And so if you look at this slide, this actually was a publication that took place in England. And so what would take place is you have these performances of slaves on a plantation, and this happened at the same time that you have a very strong anti-slavery movement taking place in the North and in England, for example. And so the British would send journalists to the South to observe Southern slavery to see, is it really bad? And so what would take place is they would hear about journalists in the area. They would have slaves stationed in a particular area. So when they hear that this journalist is going to come to this plantation, they'll have the slave rush to the plantation. And so when the journalist sort of walks up or in a carriage, they start automatically singing and dancing. They're all placed in line. And so it's a very specific choreographed way. And so it's interesting because that was also consumed and believed. So it says slavery as it exists in America, and you see slaves are playing the banjo, which is a common instrument. They're dancing, they're very happy. And it says slavery as it exists in England, and they were actually comparing wage labor for whites in England to slavery in the South and saying, look, slaves are so much happier to it. And this was a part of many of them sort of organizing for labor in England, saying, look how bad we're treated. We're treated even worse than the slaves in America. And the way they showed the happiness, and people is that they're so happy, all they do is sing and dance, and they do a little work. And so that's really sort of the public image, the onstage image of how slavery is being depicted. Lost my space. So, and now let's sort of go backstage, because we realize that life on stage is a false reality. It was constructed for a public image to support plantation society. Whites needed to believe their slaves were happy and content to justify slavery while validating their role in the system. Because to be able to sleep in your home, you have to believe that your slaves, which outnumber you, are actually happy, even though you know it's not true. It's really, many ways, this sort of, you have to accept the false story in your head. You have to accept that they're singing because they're happy slaves, so they're not going to kill me in my sleep. And that was really, really needed. And Southern whites did not want to think they were actually bad people. And so they need the North to think slavery's good, I'm a good slave master. They need England to think slavery's good, we need this system to continue. They needed their fellow planters and white society to know, I'm a good master. And so I'll have questions in the end, please. And so, and I'll cut it a little short because I know some of you have questions. So let's go backstage. Backstage, as it says, is of relating to occurring or situated behind a performing area of a theater, concealed from the public-private area. It was a typical Sunday on that September 9th, 1739 in South Carolina. The enslaved communities throughout a burgeoning North America customarily gathered on this day for the upkeep of their homes, to enhance family solidarity, and to exchange the collective cultural expressions of music, song, and dance. These gatherings allowed for a temporary relaxation, the brief deliverance from fear and from the lash, producing a metamorphosis in their appearance and demeanor. The Black community relished in the rare times they were able to come together for music and dance gatherings, affectionately known among many Blacks as frolics. So when dozens of slaves began to gather, they did not initially garner attention from the white community as out of the ordinary. But then the insurrection began, with several slave conspirators killing a local storekeeper before ransacking the store to steal firearms, ammunition, and weapons. Led by a bondsman named Jimmy, 20 slaves marched through town, killing any white person and burning down every plantation they came across. The rebels marched, calling out liberty and beating drums while pursuing all the white people they met and killing man, woman, and child, according to one witness. During their march, the rebels set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Blacks to them. One of the few witnesses recalled that the music and dance inspired other enslaved Blacks to join the rebellion. Quote, they increased every minute by new Negroes coming to them, so there were about 60, some say 100. With the sound of music encouraging the rebels and spurring more to revolt, these bondsmen and bondswomen, acting boldly, battled the militia before eventually being dispersed and some defeated. Later, however, several slaves formed another group and proceeded toward the maroon city of St. Augustine in the Spanish colony of Florida. About 10 of them were caught fleeing the next day. The insurrection was still not over, however, And a week later, a group of slaves fought the militia about 30 miles from the original rebellion site. Stono's Rebellion, named in honor of Stono's Bridge, where the insurrection began within 20 miles of Charleston, represented the complicated nature of music and dance within the emerging Southern plantation society in the early 18th century. Although whites used music and dance to assert and legitimize their dominance, the performing arts also held a concealed power for the enslaved populations. Their dances and drums were used as tools of encouragement for the rebellion. Throughout West Africa, continued in the Middle Passage, and brought to the New World, the South Carolina enslaved population carried with them their homeland's culture of music and dance. Specifically, drums in this insurrection could have represented two roles. First, as a means of communication, for throughout West Africa, the talking drum was an aspect of many societies. And second, as a means of encouragement, similar to war drums that were used during battles through their homeland region. Also, dancing was a political, cultural, and social expression that held long traditions throughout many areas of West Africa and parts of Central Africa, as building martial acrobatic skills. Dancing to prepare for war, to express hand-to-hand combat, to train, and to establish stability, reflex, parring skills was common in many West African cultures. Specifically, the war dances of the Central African Kingdom of Congo were well known at this time, and many African slaves in South Carolina originated from that region. In some of the cultures that West and Central Africans brought to North America, dancing was used as a tool of sedition. Throughout backstage exchanges, blacks continually defined themselves through the dances and music they performed and the songs that they sung. Some blacks stole away for religious exchange and growth, developing their own ideals of Christianity while incorporating West African cultures with American religious traditions to develop their own distinct African American culture. Others sang songs that denigrated dominant class. For still others, these backstage expressions provided a space in which to plan, coordinate open rebellion against slavery and their subordinate state and whiteness. Backstage, the sound of the banjo and sights of slaves dancing the ring shout revealed that the correlation of music and dance with negative stereotypes of contented, cheerful slaves conflicted with the benefits these performing arts provided to slaves. Furthermore, the labels many whites placed on black music and dance were often strategically restructured to facilitate powerful tools to rebel and resist their subjugated status. For example, former bondsman Tom Wilson was held in slavery in New Orleans and continually attempted to run away. After several attempts, he was finally successful during the Christmas holiday in the 1850s. As Wilson later explains, during his escape, he came across men who were watching for him. So he actually came across the patrollers who were looking for him, who were looking for this escaped slave. In order to elude capture, he began to literally whistle and sing and perform for the people who were looking for him. And so while walking past, he started to sort of dance for them. He did a ditty, he sung some songs. Due to whites' belief that singing and dancing slaves were happily subservient, a singing slave posed no threat. Wilson used this onstage facade and romanticized ideas of blacks' nature against the perpetrators of the myth. However, backstage, Wilson was rebelling against his bondage. The overall institution and the stereotype of blackness, though through the simple act of singing in the midst of his escape. And he actually gave him pennies while doing this, so he was able to escape with a little bit more money. Blacks continually expressed such enjoyment within the plantation system under the guise of the performing arts. The trickster tactics were an aspect of many West African cultures, bought and continued within the black community. Blacks within the institution of slavery were able to transform the trickster into music and dance and incorporate them into their backstage performances. The simple act of singing may have appeased Southern sensibilities and contributed to the folklore of the South, but when examined further, it became evident that music was an active element of the opposition of slavery. Slave songs on stage flattered the pride of the owner and possibly even drew favor from the owner. Frederick Douglass recounted the lyrics of a popular song of these performers. One song would say, I am going away to the great house farm, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. My old master is a good master, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. On stage, these lyrics supported whites' ideals of benevolent paternalism, while for the enslaved community, the song was full of meaning and a tone of testimony against slavery. It wasn't usual for the next line to say, master's going to hell. That was often stated in slave songs, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. But because they sung it so happy and it's sound and they're smiling, what taking place is whites aren't actually listening to the lyrics. They just see a smiling slave that they think won't kill them that night and that they think is submissive. And so in many ways, they're singing this song, but they're actually putting down the master. And so what you see in a lot of the slave songs is double entendres, which has continued in African American community if you listen to hip hop, and that's sort of a big part of these songs would have two different meanings. Amongst the slaves, they'll hear the same lyrics and think one way, and the slave master will think another. So this is really a part of the on-stage, backstage dynamic. Young children often found these lessons vexing. They had to teach, so this was actually a learned part of the slave community. They were teaching their children how to essentially perform on stage and backstage in this system. And because consequences, if they didn't learn this properly, would be brutal. For example, a child, Susan Snow, she spent a lot of time in the big house. And one day, she was singing a song in the big house that she often heard in the slave quarters. And it was, "Oh, General Pope, he had a short gun, fitted full of bum. Kill 'em as they come, call a union band, make the rebels understand, to leave our land, submit to Abraham." These lyrics clearly express a pro-Northern sentiment during the early stages of the Civil War. Because of her singing the song, and she was such a young child, she didn't realize that the lyrics that she heard in the slave quarters, they sung at different sound, same beat in the big house. And so because she didn't know that, she ends up getting beat with a broom by her slave mistress. But it was actually a really interesting lesson in showing us that the same beat, the same tempo was used for the song, but the lyrics changed and were adjusted. But she was too young to kind of catch on in knowing how to essentially survive the onstage, backstage dilemma. So as a child, she had yet to recognize that slaves lived within a dual world of subjugation and agency. This double consciousness was well concealed through the music and dance culture that developed truly in the presence of whites, who often remained unaware of the multiplicity of music, song, and dance among the enslaved black population. The ability to maneuver between onstage and backstage worlds often was taught to children during their rearing. However, contingent upon their proximity to the slave community, some enslaved blacks may have undergone a longer process in obtaining the trickster elements of music and dance. Adults had to teach these complicated rituals to younger generations of slaves, while slave children also were expected to perform on stage to entertain whites. Backstage, older slaves taught them how to use the same tools to gain power and to cope within the horrific conditions. In Tennessee, for example, former slave Thomas Rutling, who was large enough, he was a young boy, his mistress would bring him to the big house to sing and dance daily for her amusement. In the evening, the young Thomas returned to the slave quarters, entering into the private community of his fellow slaves at that time in 1862, and that's very early in the Civil War, and the slave community was fully aware that this war was taking place. So Thomas Rutling was told by the local minister, quote, "Now, Tom, you mustn't repeat a word of this." He went on to tell the youth, "Look mighty obedient while performing for the mistress, all the while listening and reporting back to the enslaved community any information you hear about the war." In the evening, after Thomas returned from the big house, within half an hour, every slave on a plantation would know what was going on in master's house. They diligently affected on-stage performances, yet all the while Thomas Rutling and those of Tennessee's plantation were backstage rebelling and obtaining covert information pertinent to their survival. Other aspects of slave artistic performances, however, lay further from the eyes and influences of whites. The privacy of the frolics within the slave quarters were a major aspect of blacks' cultural development. Ex-slave Fannie Fulcher remembered that they used to have big parties sometime on the Millet Plantation in Georgia. And these were treasured events, especially if no whites were present. Though the overseer occasionally monitored these performances in the slave quarters, Fulcher believed that frolics were best held away from the watchful eyes of the white community. Whites allowed slaves to sing and dance within certain perimeters over which they had control, but slaves often found ways to frolic without this gaze. Secret meetings in the slave quarters or in the forest were known as, quote, stealing away by slaves. Many ex-slave Chris Franklin explained that he never heard of stealing slaves, but he heard of stealing away, meaning not getting permission to go and have their private time. Blacks were stealing or reclaiming control, power, culture through these covert gatherings. And so the interesting part is they found very creative ways to steal away. They would often sing a song during a day saying that they're meeting at a particular location, and they would have strings tied to trees in the woods. So if you have patrollers who are looking for these slaves who are stealing away, they would actually trip over the string. And they would do an overturned vessel, a big pot, because there was a West African cultural belief that sound was physical and it was moving. And so this pot could actually, which is interesting, could actually obtain this sound. And so they found really creative ways to have these private frolics. And this was known as some of the happiest times within the enslaved community, away from the gaze of whites, where they can socialize and strategize. During their frolics, enslaved blacks enjoyed each other's company, conversed freely within their quarters. Alan Dozier in South Carolina remembered that the field hands and house servants forgot cares and merriment and dancing after the day's work was over. These two groups coming together also allowed some exchanges to take place under the guise of the frolic. Former slave Benjamin Russell from Chester, South Carolina, reported on the manner by which slaves received news. Many plantations, quote, were strict about this, but the greater the precaution, the alerter became the slaves. The wider they opened their ears and the more eager they became for outside information. Often, quote, girls that waited on the table, the lady maids and drivers, they would pick up everything they heard and pass it on to the other slaves during these frolics in which field and house slaves were able to come together. Enslaved men and women often used frolics as a time to gossip. Former slave Elizabeth Rose Hitt commented on the frolic stating, the slaves had a good time in there. They talked about the master's business in their quarters, the sexual liaisons, domestic abuse, financial hardships, insecurities present in white society were likely topics during these frolics. It wasn't unusual if the master's cheating with another person, if the master is having economic problems. That's really big and important because they know that maybe a sale is going to take place, so they can take some precautions. And they really, for example, if one slave heard that master's having a problem and thinking about selling a particular slave, it wasn't usual for that particular slave to hide in the woods while they were coming to get them to be sold. And so they had some power to negotiate of sort of if they're going to be sold, if they're able to get this information. And music and dance was often used as sort of a cover to exchange this information. The economic conditions of the planter class could have severely affected slave community. Therefore, it was tactical for blacks to stay abreast of the inner workings. Former slave George Womble was raised on a plantation in Georgia during the antebellum era. He remembered that the enslaved community continually plotted on how to get rid of their overseers. Every time the planter, Mr. Womble, would hire a new overseer, he always told the prospect that if he couldn't handle the slaves, his services would not continue. Upon hearing this, the cook would inform the slaves within frolics, and they would decide how they would handle this. So this particular plantation was very well organized. What they would do is they would organize music and song dances, and the cook would go to these frolics and say, okay, they're hiring a new overseer. And so what would take place is they would slow down work if they didn't like the overseer or if they've heard bad things about this overseer. He's too hard. The way they slow down work is they slow down the tempo of their song during labor songs. So they literally just slow down the actual way they sung the song. So if they're picking cotton, they're going to, because the way they pick cotton was the beat of the song. They slowed it down. And if they slowed it down enough, it looked like the overseer wasn't doing the job, they can get rid of the overseer. If they wanted to keep a particular overseer, they'll speed up the song, and it looks like the overseer is having being more productive. So this particular slave community was very, very smart, and it wasn't unusual. White folks do as they please, and darkies do as they can. This slave saying illustrates that blacks consistently created covert ways to rebel against or survive their servitude. This pattern was quite apparent in their song lyrics. While some songs blatantly contained specific rebellious lyrics, others relied on secretive language only decipherable by fellow bondsmen and bondswomen. Although the peculiar institution of slavery varied according to region, crop, and population, music, song, and dance performances were shared experiences that blacks and whites communities had for centuries. The performing arts that is often highlighted in slavery films, books, and memories must not be, it has to be reconsidered. The problem is the on-stage performances of slavery is what's often remembered. That is what is in popular memory. For blacks, on the one hand, chorus performances were key in constructing stereotypes and subjugation, but on the other, they served as a means for blacks to achieve power, identity, cultural survival, and rebel. For whites, music and dance proved a psychological and public image of a contented, happy slave system that supported whites, while the same performing arts were as aspect of rebellion and resistance. Ringshot Willabout, The Racial Politics of Music and Dance in North American Slavery, explores these complex layers music and dance held in each institution of slavery and broadens, hopefully, our overall view of race, culture, and entertainment in American history. Thank you.
Wow. I'm sure you guys have wonderful questions. Please come up to the mic if you do, right in the center.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. That was an incredible talk.
Thank you.
I had one question. You mentioned how a lot of this obviously carries forward throughout history, throughout black music in a lot of different ways. So I just was hoping you could elaborate upon how throughout jazz and throughout hip hop, a lot of these same concepts of like using stereotypes to create identity and power and everything else that you talked about, how has that carried through and how does that still show throughout the history of jazz and hip hop?
In so many different ways. So I'm gonna stick to, for example, the onstage backstage, especially with jazz. So if you look at, for example, the Harlem Renaissance era, and what you have is you have these segregated clubs where you have blacks performing jazz, this sort of new sound jazz, to a white audience. And especially when you have, they start to get very formal. But then these same musicians after are going to rent parties, right? And they're bringing their instruments and they're playing jazz, but they're really changing the style. And so you have improvisation earlier in rent parties in sort of these all black segregated spaces of blackness where you have a different sound coming out. Eventually that jazz is going to come, but you have this sort of public perception. Even jazz was sort of formalized in some ways for a white public, and there's a different sound in the back. I'm originally from New Orleans, so if you look at the history, and jazz is sort of like it runs through our blood, and so if you look at it, jazz in the beginning was in sort of stripper clubs and really, really considered raunchy. Formally, if you look at sort of the beginning, and then as it goes into Harlem Renaissance and travels up north, it becomes formalized, but you still have this sort of on-stage, backstage. There's a different sound in brick parties. There's a different style. There's even a different accent that blacks have that performing in brick parties than they have on the stage. Now, hip-hop, I sort of mentioned hip-hop really in many ways continues the on-stage, backstage, which could be debated. Lupe Fiasco sort of has a song that talks about this sort of facade of what you have to do in public and the portrayal of blackness in public, and then the idea of what blackness is and what these actual musicians are in private. And so you see the on-stage, backstage continuing to be a dilemma for African Americans in entertainment. And you hear this continue. In hip-hop, you see, in many ways, the culture of the double entendre. If you listen to hip-hop, it's going to mean something different for different people, right? I'm from New Orleans, So when I listen to Lil Wayne, certain things he's going to refer to, unless you're from New Orleans, you don't really get it. But you're still rapping it, and you're going to get something else from it. And he does have, there is a really way that they use language where they're saying two different things at one time, speaking. And so how you, double entendre is something that really was signifying, really kind of continued. And you see this very early on in slavery. And that's one of the really good things about hip hop, because you're able to see a lot more culture that I think people want to recognize with the complexity of West African cultures continue. And so you see it, you see on stage, backstage, but you also see that music style really start to get affected. But this internal dilemma, I keep thinking of Dave Chappelle. When Dave Chappelle left his show, I don't even remember how many years ago that was, he said on Oprah, he said, I don't want black people mad at me. And so he's talking about this, and he talks about this sort of moral dilemma of, he's putting out a particular performance, and he's using satire, which is hard, and this is going to be received one way by a black audience, and it's going to receive another way, and he had some conflict in this. And he had conflict, this idea of on stage, backstage, of what it is to be so black and what's expected of you publicly. And you are constantly putting on this performance, and then how to do it privately. And you see this in musicians, you see this in the style. That's one of the reasons that some people have argued improvisation took a little bit longer, because jazz had to be formalized. And so, you know, it's a very interesting way, because oftentimes people think of music like jazz as always being acceptable. In fact, now it's considered like an upper class. But it started in, you know, the shacks where prostitution was very, very common. And then kind of moved and became, but that sound sort of disappeared and was formalized, and then it became popular to have that type of sound. So you see, you know, artists sort of fight back with bebop, and it's really interesting how the on-stage, backstage dynamic, especially when it comes to musicians and performers, continues. But the good thing is that what took place is sounds like hip-hop allowed for that backstage sound to be publicly viewed. The problem is the interpretation may not always be understood.
I actually have a question. You mentioned it a little bit, but as far as minstrel shows go, as you know, there are two types, right? So there's the regular minstrel, where there are white people that dress up in blackface, but then there's another, the black minstrel. And I kind of have a two-part question. Would we say the first minstrel show is like the birth of appropriation? And then also, when it comes to the black minstrel show, it's almost kind of like you're saying it's funny that you mentioned Dave Chappelle, because we could say that he is an example of someone who's a modern day black minstrel. You know, the satiric double entendres of his work, offensive to others, can be seen as mocking his own race, you know, that kind of thing. So I was wondering if the idea of black minstrels, was that actually empowering, or did that just further degrade?
So you hit a lot of areas.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I have so many questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So my book ends with the minstrel show starting. Well, it ends with sort of how my argument is that Southern whites forcing blacks to slave as their amusement. The North did not have slaves. And so the minstrel show started as a way for they to have sort of this play on dominance. They can play, imagine themselves as slave masters by sitting in this audience, and even though it is whites and black face, they have power. They manipulate the stage. And so they themselves are within the performance of the minstrel show. Because since they don't have physical power over blacks through slavery, they can sort of pretend, have this false reality through the minstrel show. But you have to realize, early on, they thought they were actually black. Many who went to white minstrel show, they had to start advertising themselves as, hey, I'm actually a white person. Because they did not come across as many black people. However, when blacks enter into, and they don't really enter the minstrel show until after slavery. You don't have, except for maybe one true, you really don't have blacks performing in blackface after slavery, but they are different. And so blacks, if you want to be an actor in early 1900s, and I'm thinking of like Burt Williams, for example, he wanted to be an actor. He did not want to put on blackface. Many formerly trained Shakespearean actors, black, want to perform Shakespeare, want to perform. However, to enter into entertainment, they had to put on blackface. And so the way they, in many ways, on stage, backstage, they started to add new dynamics to blackface minstrelsy. For example, they had different complexions. So they didn't just have one, look. And they started to have, they didn't have just the extreme stereotypes. They'll have the stereotypes. So it's sort of like feeding white America just a little bit of what's actually going on. They'll have some of the same stereotypes to make people comfortable, but then they would have these black characters more complicated. They added women to the stage. And they added more complexity to the stage where they tried to sort of dig at that stereotype, but at the end of the day, American entertainment is founded on racism. And so you can't just they're trying to kind of navigate in it. Now, that's different, the comedy is a different ball of wax, because that's not unusual, and I think that's sort of a problem with black comedians is that they always have to answer to the black community, and the problem is that they always have to represent all black people. Now, you can be white, you can be a female, talking about yourself is the most common thing in comedy, right? I mean, comedians either have the highest self-esteem or lowest self-esteem because they're constantly talking about themselves and they're making themselves the butt of the joke. Dave Chappelle happens to make, now I didn't see his new comedy sketch, so I really don't want to talk about that one because I heard the dramas, I haven't seen it. But he's making himself the butt of the joke, which is very, very common. However, he uses satire, which is sort of the most intellectual way of doing humor, and most people don't get. And so he really was trying to, and I'm talking about his show, not his current stance, because he's different than he was in his show. He really was in his show trying to fight racism and do it through but he did it in a witty way, and people didn't get it. And so a part of it also was jokes that were backstage, sayings that were backstage in the black community. There are things that people say, everyone has in their own populations. There's things you say in people who look like you and speak the same language that you don't say in front of the other. And he brought that to the stage. And so did Paul Mooney. And so that isn't unusual in that show. And so because of that, black entertainers are always tipping the line of minstrelsy. They're always having to negotiate to make sure they're not a minstrel. And I think that we need to be very cautious when we refer to the term, because minstrel, I think people are, especially in the African American community, are a lot harder on black entertainers than they are any other race. And I think it's because you put the burden of the whole race on their shoulders, and it's just a lot to handle. And so, but that really has to do, it's performance. And it's really, as a musician, as an entertainer, you really want to be known as your craft. But when you're a black musician, that always comes first. It's very similar to be a female. It's like female musician. Like they have to put female in front of that because I don't know what that means. Like how do people? I'm always like, does that mean my trumpet have to be pink? Like what do you mean? And so, but it's the complexity of the weight that you're carrying. You're carrying your gender, you're carrying your race, you're carrying your ethnic group, and so it's a very interesting aspect of it. So to me, the minstrel show. The minstrel show that is being performed today is also being performed by politicians at college parties. If you really, Trudeau being coming out now. And so that sort of being the continuous of this. And the blackface minstrel show is simply a romanticization of, it's simply mockery and putting down and romanticizing that I can't be over you like we were at one time. So I'm going to put on this face and sort of play this subservience and play this subjugation and really in many ways highlight whiteness. By putting on blackface, you highlight your whiteness more than any other time.
Wow. Thank you. Do we have time for one more question?
I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on this when you were talking about how white slave owners in the South would put on this kind of show with their slaves to make it seem like they were happy. it made me think that maybe slavery didn't really go away in America, that they just got better at hiding it, to where, like in situations where gerrymandering and redlining create like these minority populated communities that are disproportionately impoverished and have less access to education, and then those people don't get a better education, and where was I going with this? They then legislation like created like laws that are more affecting minority communities, like how cocaine and crack cocaine are the exact same thing. But if a white man is holding cocaine, is arrested, he will get like 10 times less the jail time than an African American. So do you think that in the prison industrial complex in America, that these minority populations in jail are more akin to this form of slavery, like in the South?
Ask your question a different way.
Oh, okay.
The last part, just the last part.
Okay. Do you see relations with how whites in the South are representing the slave population and how America is representing its incarcerated population to the rest of the world?
Okay, so it's an interesting parallel that you're making. I don't see that in the same way. One, because I don't think America is representing its prison population is happy or content. I think they are, what they're doing is, the reason that the way they're representing the prison population, specifically those of color and blacks, is this is what happens when you don't have slavery. When you have slavery, they're happy. When you don't have slavery, you don't have a system that makes them happy, so therefore now they're dangerous. And that was stated very soon after. I kind of started with those quotes of very soon after slavery ended. That's what was what kept being said. And so the quotes that I started with the Georgia woman says, "I'm actually scared of them." What you have taking place is the prison industrial system starting at this time. So when I'm doing these quotes, that's what's starting. And so, and it's starting as a convict lease system, where blacks are being forced into this convict lease system for doing nothing, for not having a contract with a white employer, for anything, for simply being a black male. And so what you have is that they sell, however they want to treat black people, they sell them that way. And so they're selling them as happy because that means that slavery is a good system. And now that they're putting them in prison, they're selling them as criminals. Because you have to realize the same people that were happy 20 years ago in my story were then criminals 20 years later, and innately criminal, innately savage. Everything's always innate. They're born that way. And so, so the prison industrial system that you see today is directly related to this from yesterday, which is they're happily submissive. But if they're not submissive, happy and submissive codes together. They're synonymous in this period. When they're no longer, when we can't force them to do this, then they're criminals. And so you see this, and it's interesting because once they become criminals and you have like the gang labor system where they're actually working in gang labor, you have a good amount of recording during that time of them forcing them to sing songs to keep the pace. So they were singing songs to keep the pace in cotton plantations, tobacco plantations. And now they're forcing convicts who, many of them did no crime, definitely didn't have a proper trial, to now sing songs that now reflect their current status. So you see that same type of music, but they still want to hear, and you definitely see the patrolmen forcing them to sing during that time too. And so it's a very interesting parallel, but it's sort of like, this is what happens when you don't keep them as slaves. And I don't know if I answered your question because I wasn't completely sure, but yeah. Hopefully I did.
One question. When they were forced to sing and to play music, were they imposed what type of music to play and what instrument? You mentioned they were given a fiddle play and they would buy slaves or have musical talents. Were they particular in terms of style, obligating them to play any particular style of music?
Yes, they definitely, they had like a sort of Italian style, because sometimes they would play 4 white dances, so they had to do certain dances, which is funny. That's how the dance, the cakewalk. You know, I've heard of the cakewalk, which became popularized. And what that was you have blacks that are forced to play for these white dance events, and you have black slaves outside who are making fun of the whites dancing inside, and that's what's known as later the cakewalk. They're literally they're mocking them. And so, but you do have certain songs that are going to be performed a particular way in front of whites, for whites, and they'll request it to be faster, request it to be slower, whatever they find entertaining at the time. And that's going to affect culture. You know, that's going to affect how they think music should. So you do have, and you have different music that's played among slaves that you have with whites. Spirituals are very, very popular now. However, they were not popular and well known during slavery. They became popular because of Fish Jubilee singers. Fish Jubilee singers were actually singing basic operatic songs to raise money for Fisk University. And what took place was, in private, they were singing spirituals that their mother and grandmother taught them. And the music director heard it and said, hey, why don't you try one of those songs? They did not want to do that because spirituals were considered so private, because they had so many meanings in it. They didn't want to do that in front of a white audience. So now we think of people just knowing spirituals, like everyone was singing Go Down Road. No, that was something that was sung backstage and privately. It was more labor songs that they were singing in front. So you do have this difference. It's now more public because of those type of groups doing something private, but then people all of a sudden having this interest because it's very popular. Blackness and the idea of blackness is very popular. Even in during this time with the Fish Jubilee singers, which was only a few years after slavery. And so that, then you have spirituals become, and so the bondsmen and bondswomen chose particular songs and dances to do in front of whites. Some were requested, and some were like, hey, this is what you do to entertain white folk, this is what we do when we're at home, in the private. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, I am delighted to present our last presentation. Divine Inspiration, the Artistic Trajectory of Alice Coltrane, an innate conversation with her daughter, Michelle Coltrane, and musical guest, Surya Botosofina. A little more about Michelle Coltrane. She was born in Paris, France, and is the only daughter of Alice and John Coltrane. She has toured the US and France as a soloist and has performed with artists such as Kenny Kirkland, Jeff Watts, Ronnie Laws, Billy Childs, Jack DeJohnette, Marvin Smitty Smith, Reggie Workman, the Gap Band, and McCoy Tyner Trio at the Monterey Jazz Festival. Her music has been praised by Jazz Times and won a Yes Award. Okay, that's great. Yes is a good thing, right? Michelle was featured performer at the 2013 Panama Jazz Festival. Yes. Absolutely. Let's see, where was I? Okay. Recent appearances also include the John Ford Amphitheater in Los Angeles, the Miami Jazz Festival, Vibratos in Bel Air, California, Bar 1912 in Beverly Hills, California, Yoshi's Jazz Club in Oakland, California, and Fort Bend, Indiana Jazz Festival. Michelle has worked recently with Jerry Gibbs, Lonnie, Plaxico, thank you, Alex Collins, Abe Lagrimas, and, can you help me? Mahesh Balasurian, Edwin Livingston, Paul McDonald, Raman how do you pronounce his last name? Yelis? Isalis, Ravi Coltrane, Ron Jerome Avant, Shea Welsh, and Miguel Atwood Ferguson. Please welcome Michelle Coltrane.
Thank you, everyone. Just because of that last presentation, it came to mind that 150 years later, on Sundays, this is what we were singing. A little purification of the air and the mind. There are always three. You're welcome to join me on this one if you'd like. This is a song of praise that we sang on every Sundays until my mother's passing. It's called Om Namah Turiya Sangitananda. 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 Om Namah Guru Devi. Om Namah Guru Devi. Om Namah Guru Devi. Om Namah Guru Devi. Shri Guru Devi Sharanam. Shri Guru Devi Sharanam. Shri Guru Devi Sharanam. Shri Guru Devi Sharanam. We sang it as a group, as a congregation every Sunday. Sharanam. I'm here today with Surya Bodhifasina, who grew up on the land. He's going to speak later in the presentation. Welcome. Today we're speaking about, Today we'll be speaking about the life and journey of Alice Coltrane, a musician, a mother, and spiritual leader. We began with a Sanskrit song of praise and this beautiful photo of her later in her life. So I needed to pick some areas of reference, things that were relative that I could put into this amount of time. So my mother was born in the 30s, but I'm going to start in the 60s and maybe make some reference to her childhood in Detroit, where she was born. I also may refer to her as Alice, or Mother, or Swamini, or Turiya. She was born in Paris, France. Actually, she went to Paris, France. I was born in Paris, France, in 1960. She was following her dream of being a musician, and she met a man in Detroit named Ken Haygood. My grandmother frowned upon my mother going off to Paris with this gentleman unless they got married. Those were the times. So they got married, and off they went. She studied with legendary pianist Bud Powell in Paris. But soon she returned to Detroit because the marriage didn't work out. However, she had a little surprise with her, and that would be me, Michelle. This is some of the footage we have from Paris, which is online, and actually she's playing. This was in the bebop time in her life. Alice had 2 brothers and 6 sisters. They grew up on the east side of Detroit in the 1940s, where Mother attended Olive View Baptist Church and played organ at the age of 9 for the choir. She received a small amount of money every Sunday for that. However, she didn't keep it. She would give the money to her mother, Annie McLeod. At that time, there were 9 people living in a 2-bedroom apartment. At bedtime, her brothers slept in the kitchen, parents, Annie and Solon, in the living room, and the other girls slept in the bedroom. She said they were a happy, normal family from their perspective. Alice was a self-taught musician. Her parents could not afford a piano, so a woman that lived in the building named Miss Philpott had a piano, and my mother would go up, and Miss Philpott gave her lessons, but she wasn't like a formally trained teacher. She kind of gave her the basics on the piano. And from that time period, when all the other kids were outside playing, they said they could see my mother in the window practicing away up there. So she never had a piano until many years later of her own. Uh-oh, am I doing something wrong here? She met and married John Coltrane in the mid-60s. I remember the home in Long Island, New York. It was filled with a lot of instruments. They traveled a lot. So we had items from Japan. We had a koto. We had a sitar from India. And we had bagpipes. We had a piccolo. We had, those were like our toys. In the basement, there was a state-of-the-art recording studio being built. And sadly, my father did not live to see its completion. He passed away on June 23rd, 1967. At that time, my mother went to Detroit, not doing well, naturally, a widow now, devastated at the age of 29, with 4 children between the ages of 6 months old and 6 years of age. And here's a photo of us a little bit later after that in Connecticut at a spiritual retreat. There's my brother Robbie. Next is John Jr., the youngest, Oran, mother, and myself. A little blurry there. Through time, the values of John and Alice are continually reflected in their deep commitment to God and music. The 70s are a very important time period, creatively and spiritually. A powerful reoccurring theme in Alice's life is crisis into transcendence. When she was faced with adversity, she did not succumb, she transcended. I believe this is a part of her art and life that people find inspiring. I know I do. We see this in the 1960s when, as a young woman, single mother, and now a widow at this time, she continues to pursue her musical career. She begins a period of intense spiritual and artistic transformation. In this photo, Swami Satchidananda, is that the right photo? Okay. Is sitting on the stone pillar next to my mother. He was her spiritual teacher, and in this photo, where she had traveled to India one of the first times, there were many pilgrimages over the decades. This is the beginning of her transition from Alice Coltrane to Turiya Sangeetananda. Swami Ni, instead of Swami Ji, is the female spiritual master who has conquered the lower passions and egotism. This is a quote from a book, Portrait of Devotion, written by Shankari Adams, a student of my mother and her secretary for 30 years. During Alice's initiation and self-anointing ceremony, the Lord conferred the highest blessings upon her. Receive this sacred emblem of your transcendental renounced order. together with an eternal garland of my supreme grace. Then Mother received the Sanskrit name Turiya Sangeetananda, that translates as the Transcendental Lord's highest song of bliss. And then she wore orange. The orange color is sacred. I'm wearing one of her scarves. In Hindu, it represents the color of fire and the burning away of impurities. Also, there's a vow of celibacy that some people wear the orange for when they're taking on those vows. She recorded many albums in this short period of time right after the death of her husband for Impulse Records as a leader in the home studio in Long Island. Some of the names of those albums are Monastic Trio, Huntington Ashram for the town of Huntington, Long Island, Patha the El Daoud, which is dedicated to an Egyptian god who was beloved. Also Journey into Satchidananda. So also, she recorded with Santana, Carlos Santana. And they recorded a song, Going Home, which we put in here, for the significance of us leaving Long Island and moving to California. The song, Going Home, is on the Welcome album. And it has much significance at this time. It was when this ashram was born in Agora Hills, California, where my mother purchased 48 acres of property. And after several tries of starting an ashram in San Francisco and one in Woodland Hills, they settled here. We all settled here. And this temple was built with dorms and an industrial kitchen, and children grew up here, including this child that I used to babysit when he was just a tater tot. I also received a spiritual name, Sita. So I call myself Sita Michelle. My mother referred to me as Sita for the rest of her life. Sita means the embodiment of all feminine virtues. My brothers also received spiritual names. Ravi is Narayan. John Jr. was Arjuna. And my youngest brother, Oran, was Ramla. Here's a photo from that time where here I am with Mom, Ravi, young Oran. Even my mother's sister, Marilyn McLeod, is in this photo. My mother started teaching meditation and chanting. She taught us how to meditate, and she taught us how to chant. And when I asked her, well, what are we talking about? Because I couldn't understand all the Sanskrit, she said, these are holy names, the holy names of God. And she had a very universal approach to it. And so it was just not Sanskrit. We also sang Christian songs. And there would be vegetarian meals on Sunday after the Sunday service, where my mother wouldn't miss that. Boy, if I had a wedding plan, she was not going to miss a Sunday service. But she taught us many bhajans that are Hindu hymns. And every Sunday she would introduce a few. So as the years went by, it's just like we built up this repertoire of Hindu songs. Sadly, my brother John Jr. left the body as a result of an accident. He's standing behind my mom, the tallest one, but not with the big afro there. I remember receiving the call that my brother had passed away, and I rushed to my mother's home, and I was grief-stricken. I was early 20s, and when I saw my mother's face, I expected to see her looking destroyed. She just lost her son, and this speaks to her discipline and her belief. I asked her, how are you able to hold yourself with such calm? And she said, I had that son for 17 years. She said, some women leave the hospital without any baby after a pregnancy. He lived a good life, and he was loved and well taken care of. And I thought, whoa, boy, it's just stopped me for 1 minute from where I was going with the whole thing. Like, we should all be rolling around on the ground in grief. But this powerful, reoccurring theme in Alice Coltrane's life is crisis into transcendence. So this picture is in Agora. I mentioned the 48-acre parcel that she had purchased. It was open to the public on Sunday, so not only did the students that live there, also us as children, it was kind of like Sunday school and church all wrapped into kind of different clothing, but with the same intent, chanting the names of God, high holy names. Surya.
That's me. This is home for me. It's called Sign On to Mashram. And what it was is everybody has a place in your heart where you feel calm, happy, in tune with some sort of deep connection with where you feel most peaceful, right? Some people is sitting in front of the ocean. Some people is sitting in the park. For us, and for me, it's the ashram. And here we have a place where songs, being sung in Sanskrit language, are being taught to us by a black woman, a strong black woman, who is definitely from Detroit. But in our ashram, everybody was welcome. And on Sundays, there would be what was called the mandir, a picture that was earlier, which is really just the temple. It would be, here's our mandir, it would be transformed for us into this place that was filled by this large sound of her, Swamini as we called her, playing the organ every Sunday. So a lot of times when people would wonder what was happening for her musically, I personally, growing up on the ashram, had no idea who Alice Coltrane was, but I knew that Swamini plays organ every Sunday when it was really good. So we would sing songs like Om Shanti, which is a way that people would, you greet someone, you would say bye to someone, kind of like aloha.
Yeah, and you hear it at yoga class all the time.
Om Shanti, how you doing? So it was a way for us to always feel connected with someone else, and then again connected with our most inner sense of peace. kid growing up there, it felt like there was people from everywhere, all throughout the country, maybe from different parts of the world too. And how appropriate, especially in today's day and times, is that it felt like a place where we could really connect as human beings together, and it was all through the lessons and the beautiful guidance and just the absolutely literal bright light that Swamini Turyasangi Tananda, or Alice Coltrane, as a lot of people know her as, continue to show us every day, every week. And Sundays are still in my heart. Like now, like I don't even like to rehearse on Sundays. You know what I mean? Play gigs on Sundays because this is Sunday. That's my mom over there and my sister. So like, and Loran on the very, very left. Some of these people in this picture, they're not even on the planet anymore. But forever in our hearts, from Sayana to Mashram, and at the end of the day, we can just say to them, or I would say to you, Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Thank you, Surya. Actually, I wanted to say something I was thinking about saying. I mean, it was public news. All of you know about the fires that we had in California that burned up a lot of California. This property that we'd had in our family for more than 30 years actually was one of the places destroyed. Thankfully, 4 months before that, all of the students had moved off of the property, and it was for sale. We continued worshiping for 14 years after, 11 years after my mother's passing, but it was decided that we would sell the property. And 4 months later, it burned to the ground. And it was very sad. It was the end of an era, but I would say this: all of the sacred and holy rituals and beauty that took place just returned to the ground. And the only thing that remained after the fire, I mean, everything was gone. Metal, and it was unbelievable, the intensity of the fire. There was no loss of life, but the only thing left were these stairs. Just the stairs, and the rest was black. The stairs were still white, and I thought, wow, that's some significance there. My mother authored several books in her life. These books instruct, but they are not how-to books. Instead, she writes sincerely and compellingly of her studies, and most importantly, how the spiritual realm reveals itself. Anyone that's interested in acquiring any of these books or recordings can just visit alicecoltrane.com. Earlier, we spoke about the impulse recordings. Here's a glance of some of those recordings. Some of these were made in Long Island in the home studio when she was the leader on the Impulse label as a female, an African-American woman. In the late 60s and early 70s. The 70s were just a big chunk of her life. She did a lot of work. Some of those albums are in there, mixed in with an album that my brother, Robbie, produced for her. Got my mother out of semi-retirement. I would say that all the threads of her life can be heard on this recording. It's called Translinear Light. It has traditional spirituals like This Train, childhood songs, Christian gospel music, jazz standards from her husband John Coltrane's catalog, and bhajans that she played, traditional Indian Hindu bhajans that were translated into her own singular style. The album was a culmination of an incredible musical life. when we speak about music and spirituality, Alice Coltrane's music has a very prayerful quality. But there is a stretching and expansive, adventurous tone to it, and it's still anchored in that prayerful intent. It has a prayerful, yet solemn, yet uplifting feeling, and that's how I always feel happy, but it's still it just evokes an emotion that it has a serious overtone to it. Now in 2017, 10 years after Alice's passing, after she left the body, that's how she would refer to it. It's not that you died, you just leave your body. A collection of her devotional music from the 80s and 90s was released by a label owned by David Byrne of the Talking Heads. There was such an interest in this devotional music, which hadn't been commercially released. We knew this because the music was being bootlegged. She kept recording even after she wasn't with the major labels anymore. And she would put them on cassette or CD, and they were just sold in this little bookstore on the property in Agora. So now I was getting emails from people, and all over the world somehow this music, it just kind of kept showing up. So Luakabop released a compilation of this music, which prompted a European tour. And it was met with enthusiastic audiences, including a lot of young people. It was entitled The Ecstatic Music of Alice Coltrane, Turiya Sangeetananda, and it actually went #1 in the Billboard charts. And here we are. My mother's not featured here because this was in 2017 in Europe, giving a display of the music because it wasn't a concert. You know, that was kind of our biggest hurdle, was how do people heard the music through however people hear the music. It was actually on a vinyl and CD, and actually a little cute cassette too, because Luakabop they're so artistically hip and smart. But we would try to emulate what we did on Sundays. So the first rows of the theater would have pillows, because you know when you go into an ashram, you take your shoes off, and you usually sit down. In the ashram in India, women sit on one side, men sit on the other. And so people brought their children. There were people laying on the floor. These yellow pillows, as you can see in the bottom of the picture, were kind of the front. And we handed out books like you have at church when you look up the songs you're going to play. And we would sometimes have the English lyrics and the Sanskrit translation up on the screen. And yeah, it was really beautiful. I felt, even as a child, I said, I'm so proud of her, that it kind of happened again, you know, where first I watched how my mother helped preserve the legacy of her husband, who at the time wasn't, you know, was revered in his career, but really he kind of became this iconic jazz musician that still stands today. Then she passes, and a lot of her work, people just kind of, it speaks to them. There's a thirst, and it was the era and time, you know, it was like a big time for women, you know, finally. And it speaks to a thirst for healing in difficult times. Like I said, a very prayerful quality. And it speaks to an ailing portion of society in the heart. And Surya was involved with the production of the album because, like I said, from a little baby to learning to play the piano to becoming an adult and a father and a husband, he knew my mother through all various stages of his life. You know, I took a personal view because I'm her daughter, and I had to humbly, but try to be very specific to which part of her life that I thought would be of interest to people. And I appreciate you listening, because this is really the first time I did this where we just did the music. That was easy, where you just kind of get up and do the bhajans, and everybody can feel the spirit of that. But actually speaking and just kind of having dialogue, I thought it might be interesting to have a pianist, and that we would, you know, he's kind of playing in the theme, that Alice vibe that he's kind of doing on the piano. So, yeah, like Surya said, about Mom. She was indeed a woman, mother, an African American. She was the leader of groundbreaking original and experimental music in a time where was just pioneering for a woman. She also built an ashram in a westernized part of the world in the 1980s. And she led a life of service and devotion to God. It's kind of basically it. But she did definitely make an impact on me as her daughter. And glad that I could share that with all of you today. We want to end with a Sanskrit prayer. It's very simple. And it translates to lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from the fear of mortality. Lead us from the fear of death to immortality. And I also want to thank Patricia for encouraging me to develop this program, which is hopefully going to become more consolidated. And I want to thank her and the Berkeley Global Jazz for having us. Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Joytir Gamaya Mrityorma Amrutam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you.
Michelle Coltrane. Alice Coltrane. If there's anyone who has questions, please come to the microphone.
That was the essence of the music. Call and answer. It's call and answer. Thank you.
Please, is there someone that has questions for Miss Michelle? Please come up to the mic.
We just had him on here.
We had him. We had a kirtan here.
We chanted. Word. Sorry.
Anybody? All right. Said it all. Okay. Enough said sometimes.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what were the years that Alice traveled to India, and do you have any record of her study of Indian music?
The last part?
Her records of study of her Indian music?
Okay. The traveling to the India was a lot. In the 70s, at least 3 or 4 times. In the 80s, she also went at least about 10 or 12 times. I know I went 2 of the times with her. She would go to the Sai Baba ashram in Puttaparthi. And Surya also traveled to India several times and actually got a meeting with Sai Baba, which is very rare to be picked out of a crowd of thousands to go back and have a personal interview with the guru there. But are you talking about the albums that she may have listened to of traditional?
Yes, and what, kind of where did she study? What sources did she study from?
Well, when she would go, she would come back sometimes with some of the traditional bhajans. So for many years, we had already been singing these, as tots. Mm-hmm. Some of those, Sitaram Ja Sitaram, Ishwara Sitaram. And so, Raghupate Raghavara.
Gandhi film. It's pretty much the last.
Oh, right, right.
So, and it's also touched on her Translinear Light album. It's called Sitaram on the album.
That's right. It's beautiful. That's
plays it on the, I believe it's the Whirly organ. So
Wurlitzer.
You'll see this juxtaposition of a traditional bhajan. But if you don't know what a bhajan is, it's a devotional song for those of you that are just like brand new to the word. So you have these Raghupati Raga, this really interesting melody, but then adapted and so
By a
getting
jazz musician's approach.
Getting that melody, but then adapting it from where, I don't want to call it covering, you know what I'm saying? But like, yeah, you know what I mean?
But yeah.
and that kind of
Yeah.
thought, if you will, just to kind of give you a little background. Sorry.
She was really, really good with the self-teaching, actually visited. She actually bought a condo there so she could do extended stays. She was there from before there were phones, so there were times when she would go on this retreat, and for 30 days we just didn't hear from her, and we would hope that everything was okay, and it always was. And she also studied the harp, which was a gift from my father that didn't arrive until after his death, but she actually did some recordings with that. And, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, you talked a bit about India, a lot, and I liked very much your music today. And I was wondering just if in India the keys or the tone center you are playing have a symbolic signification a lot, and I was wondering if in your playing the key where you were playing had a symbolic signification today or not.
Yes. Yeah. Something that.
You want me to use the microphone? I'm playing. I'm just playing, keeping it light. But, so what your mom told me specifically, which I found very interesting, was she always said that there was something very distinct about the key of A. A minor in particular. I don't know why, but a lot of my conversations with her about music would be saying, what's the feeling? Why does a bhajan that invokes the Hindu god Shiva, which is known as the destroyer, really the destroyer of ego, why does that have a certain sound to it as opposed to a song that has the names of Krishna, another Hindu god? Why does that have a certain sound to it? And so I always would try to ask these really intelligent, thinking I'm asking like a really great question, and the answer that would come back usually would be like, oh, it's just what the Lord wanted. So I try to play in the key of A minor, and then she also told me that it also helps with string players because there's more open strings. So for me, I thought it was just so nice that I would hear that there's a distinct key center, but also with the aspect of always serving, to serve another musician. Who thinks about that? Like, I just gotta make sure that these string players have it easy today. You know what I mean? Like, so that was as far as a key center. And then as far as the last prayer that Sita sang, Asatoma, no, that wasn't chosen for a specific, like, reason, more just
rendition.
for her,
It was
for,
just a
for her
closing prayer that is a traditional prayer that is common in India, in the Hindu religion. But there are many bhajans that she sort of definitely put her own individual style on. And some of those we did sing with the group. It's very difficult to do it as just a one voice lead. I thought Juria did join in there a little bit, but when there's a big choir, you know how that also, I don't know, it just broadens the entire feeling. And then you go to India and you hear it a little drier, you know, because they've got the harmonium and it's a little more monotone. And then they would go up, do the ragas, you know, but when we would do it, it would have like a some soul
it would
in
be
it.
black, man.
Soul, if you will, you know.
You know what I'm saying? Like, it's okay to say it, right?
I feel
It
bad
would be
for saying
soulful.
it because
It would be black and soulful. That's why we, right on.
so that's,
We just had the sister that just spoke before just gave a serious amount
she broke it down.
of game. I don't use that word game in like a facetious way, but I mean like a serious amount of knowledge. And so I find it very, very interesting how these things just travel, you know, literally. And that's what I always thought was so funny, because I grew up in Southern California. There was a certain rap group that influenced my life called NWA. Difficult on an ashram to listen to NWA, but I'd be sitting in our mandir listening to her play, and I'd be bobbing my head like, why am I bobbing my head like it's a Dre beat right now? For real. But we're singing like, you know, Krishna Raman. I'm like, yeah. So it travels. It's all
interconnected, if you will.
Yeah. It all transcends.
Totally. Thank you.
Do we have time for maybe one more? One more question?
Can I ask a question? Did you guys enjoy it?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to focus on Alice. I know there's the whole John Coltrane thing, but it's another presentation.
I really love Alice Coltrane played Juria and Rama Krishna.
Oh, check it out. This was used recently in the Atlanta, the TV series with Childish Gambino. What his American name is, but yeah, they used this track, and so this is what we're speaking about, the relevance of the music, and that there is something. It just doesn't seem to go away, and has a fresh quality to it. You like that song? Yeah, that was written by Alice. Mm-hmm.
I really loved. It was so touching to raise the kids. Just talked about mother and played her music. Actually, I'm a mother of a 2-year-old son. I want to ask you what Alice Coltrane empathized when she raised you guys?
You know, she was a very gentle person, and she kind of used our conscience to be the guide. So so her discipline was that, like, you know, everything is seen. There isn't any sneaking off here and hiding. I always thought that was so difficult, where, you know, we had to worry about God seeing what we were doing, that we had to have a higher consciousness. She focused more on that than school. Honestly, we never got reprimanded for bad grades, you know, in the academic part. She wanted us to be good people and good human beings and decent people. And I looking back at that, I realize how important that is. But at the time, I just thought, you know, it's so hard to be good all the time when you're a kid. You know, you don't mean to be bad, but, you know, in certain ages, yeah, I think that it definitely made us have a beautiful ethical base as adults.
Thank you. You guys were so soulful. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank you both for coming. And thank you to all of the panelists that presented. This was such a wonderful symposium. Thank you to Patricia for curating the event. Yes. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you, everybody. And man, we have a lot to unpack after this, Jay. It's a lot of great material. So thank you so much for coming. I'll send the mic over to Patricia.
Thank you so much, Nadia Washington. Big round of applause for being the host for this symposium. Thank you to the sound people over there and light. Thanks so much. Thank you to Donna. Where is Donna? There, over there, Donna. Help us for months to make this happen. Thank you to Nico and everybody who came. Where is Nico? Nico. Thank you to Nico and the people that came from the graduate department office and everybody who helped us make this happen. We really appreciate. Thank you, Danilo and Marco, for making this space. And a big round of applause for you guys for being here and learning so much.
Have a wonderful afternoon.